So I'm going to introduce our moderator, and Johanna Adashak. Hopefully I'm pronouncing names wrong, and if I butcher, did I do it good? I really do butcher names. I have a habit of that, and it all goes back to nursery school. I explained this, I think, in a conference call a few weeks back that we had, where I was in an experimental group, actually in the first grade, that we were taught to read by sight, not by sounding out. And to this day, Harvard grad or not, I have difficulty with pronunciation. So anyway, so if I butcher your name, I apologize in advance. I want to introduce Joe, and thank you so much for being here. One of the key goals that we identified for today's program was to take a look at the key developments since fall 2022 relative to our key influencers, shifts in judicial practices, climate change, forever chemicals, corporate accountability and reporting, and public-private partnerships, and discuss what this means for the multi-stakeholder community in terms of policy, practice synergies, and site-specific applications. Quite a lot has happened in the last year, and we can't wait for our esteemed panel of experts here to highlight the most notable developments, all in 10 minutes each. I would now like to introduce Johanna Adashak, who will serve as moderator of the opening panel, What Has Happened Since Fall 2022. She'll be briefly introducing the remainder of the panel in a moment. Joe is a visiting associate professor and fellow for the Environmental and Energy Law programs at the George Washington University Law School. She worked as an honors law clerk for the Environmental Protection Agency's Office of Enforcement and Compliance Assurance in the Air Enforcement Division. She served as senior editor for the Maryland Journal of International Law, and actually published an article in 2021 recommending amending nationally determined contributions in accordance with Paris Agreement to include short-term goals and long-term carbon neutral goals modeled after the Montreal Protocol. She's a member of the Maryland Bar, JD from University of Maryland, and undergraduate degrees from Boulder in environmental studies, geography. She's very, very well educated. So with that, she will introduce the rest of the panel. Two of the panelists are virtual. She'll explain that. And John Cruden will be using slides, and those will be uploaded when do you want those uploaded now?
Yeah, I can go first.
Okay, and this, he can, John, you can speak from here or the podium?
Okay.
After your,
I'll come up.
okay, but okay.
Hi everyone, very excited to be here. We have an amazing panel, 3 in front of you, 2 online. Just as a preface, we'll start with the 3 in person, then we'll go to the online people. To my immediate left, I have John Cruden, who is currently principal at Beveridge and Diamond. He was previously president of ELI, the American College of Environmental Lawyers. He served as chief of the Environmental Enforcement Division of the ENRD, and then Deputy Assistant General, and then the Obama-appointed Assistant Attorney General for ENRD at DOJ, overseeing literally the largest environmental cases like the Deepwater Horizon spill and the VW scandal. Very exciting. Then to his left is Peter Haig. He is the Senior Director of Corporate Relations at the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. He previously served as the Director of Strategic Partnerships for the Nature Conservancy, developing and managing relationships with corporate partners. And then to our further left, we have Jeffrey Rose, who is currently the Vice President of Government Affairs and Public Policy for Battelle's Contract Research Organization. He oversees outreach, strategy, and advocacy before Congress, federal agencies, and elected officials. He works closely with Battelle's senior leadership to advance Battelle's budget, policy, legislative priorities. Online, we have Michael Gerard, who is the founder and faculty director of the Stevens Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia Law School. He wears many hats: advocate, litigator, teacher, scholar. He practiced for decades and remains a senior counsel at Arnold and Porter. And currently, he teaches courses on environmental law, climate change law, energy regulation has written or edited 14 books, including Global Climate Change in U.S. Law and Legal Pathways to Deep Decarbonization in the United States. Lastly, we have Jessica Thurston, who is also on Zoom with us. She is the Vice President of Environmental Social Governance and Sustainability at Paramount Global, where she ensures ESG priorities across Paramount Global's operations and brands, consumer products, real estate, and facilities. She previously consulted for major CPG companies, pharmaceutical, and food service companies, and initially began her career in sustainable procurement policy for the federal government. Lastly, she is an adjunct lecturer in ESG at Columbia, where she completed her master's. We're going to start with John Crittenden.
That's just a cover slide. The next one is his first slide.
Oh, there. Oh, gotcha.
Just go forward one.
Mm-hmm.
Joe, thank you so much. What Joe didn't say is that she and I team teach a master's class at George Washington University, so it's quite a pleasure for me to be with all of you. What Barbara asked me to do is to look at litigation. We're looking at cases in this 1 year period. A lot has happened during that time period. So what I'm going to try to do, because I'm looking fundamentally at what the Supreme Court has done, because that guides so much of what we have done. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Supreme Court, what's happening there. They're in the news all the time right now. And then I picked out 6 cases. 4 of them have been decided. 2 of them are coming up in the term that we have now started. We started a new term in the Supreme Court in October. And then I'll say a few things about NRD. I have slides because I'm going to do this rather quickly. I'm not going to be discussing the case. I'm really trying to narrow it to the big change and that impact it would have on natural resource damages. And so that's my goal. All right, so Supreme Court's in the news there. Just yesterday, they published their ethical guidelines the first time. Who knew? Who knew Supreme Court did not have ethical guidelines? Or last year, we learned more than we really wanted to know about all business travels and all the things that have occurred. But what I've taken here on this slide and next slide is I want you to look at, remember, these 9 individuals, extraordinary people, all quite bright, all been confirmed by the Senate. How, like in the last few years, how did they vote there? And my first slide is what we call paired voting. By that I mean who votes with other people. And it's a pretty good example. Look at my top line, Chief Justice Roberts, go across until you see Kavanaugh, 100% of the time they voted together. Look at, for another example, look at Thomas, go across to Sotomayor. They only paired 38% of the time. There. So you can tell right away that how Kavanaugh and how Roberts vote is extremely important. Why is that important? Take a look at this slide as who's in the majority. And by that I mean you take all the cases, they do about 70 a year, roughly 70 a year. You look at all those cases, who is in the majority the most? Same group, right? Roberts and Kavanaugh are in the majority the most. So if you know how they're going to vote, that's going to be very significant. By the way, there's a lot of literature out right now on the Supreme Court because everybody kind of divides those into those who were picked by Republican presidents and those who were picked by Democrats, and there's 6 and 3 to those. But there's a lot of academic literature saying that's not a really good way to look at it. It's a better way to look at it as 3-3-3. Look at the top 3. Barrett, Roberts, Kavanaugh, they tend to vote together. Alito, Thomas, Gorsuch, very closely, they tend to vote together. And then you have Kagan, Breyer, and Sotomayor. All right, here is the lineup there. This is my refreshing your recollection of the 9 justices. By the way, they did a survey recently of elementary school kids in their civic classes. More of them could name the 3 Stooges that could name 3 justices on the Supreme Court. So we all have work to do in terms of our civic education there. But look at the very top. Thomas is the senior justice now with over 31 years of experience. And right now, what does that mean? That means during oral argument, which has fundamentally changed in the last year or so coming out of COVID, he asks the first questions. He wasn't asking any questions before, and now he is. And by the way, he has quite good questions. No surprise there. All right, so that is just, and by the way, one one other little just piece of thought about the Supreme Court. They reverse on average 70% of the cases. So a case coming out of one of the circuits, 70% of the time, they're going to reverse that there. And only less than a third are they going to affirm it. So most often, they take cases to reverse them there, which is going to be relevant as I talk to you about. I told you I have 6 cases I'm pointing out. This is the first one. This is West Virginia versus EPA. This is a climate case there. During, Joe told you that I was Assistant Attorney General of Environment Division. I spent a year defending the Clean Power Plan. This is the Clean Power Plan coming out of the Obama administration. It is a so-called ACE rule, Affordable Energy Rule, coming out of the Trump administration that come up to the Supreme Court. The DC Circuit had reversed the Trump administration rule, which automatically then affirmed the Obama era. That was the case that came up to the Supreme Court. It's enormously complicated, dealing with very specific legislative parts of the Clean Air Act, 111D of the Clean Air Act. That wasn't the importance of the decision. The decision, a 6-3 decision written by the Chief Justice Roberts, the significance of that case is that Chief Justice said what EPA did was so big, it was so significant economically and politically that it is a major case. And if it's a major case, then Congress is going to have to speak way clearer than they would in a normal case. So this is the so-called major case doctrine. There is clearly before the West Virginia case that came up, but this is really the most significant use of that there. So without going into details of the case, hold the thought that we now have something that we haven't talked about before in virtually every big case, and that is this major case doctrine. And is that going to apply in that case? Predominantly, we're talking about rulemaking. In some ways, the same thought is here. And this is now the most recent term decided May of this year. And this is the famous water case, the so-called Waters of the United States case. Sackett that you see there have been litigating this case for 14 years. They had a small development they wanted to do in Idaho, not that far, a few hundred yards from Priest Lake. Corps of Engineers, EPA said that was a wetland. They disagreed. Came up to the Supreme Court one other time as to whether or not they could bring the case at all. Supreme Court said they could. And then it goes back, and then it trickles up through the district court. Then a Ninth Circuit, which sits in California, makes the decision that, yes, it is a wetland, applying a decision from 2006 called Rapanos. Rapanos was kind of a law professor's dream come true, because anything you can ever think about in wetland is somewhere in the case, and it's enormously confusing because there was no majority. It was a 4-4-1 decision. But out of that came 2 competing tests, and the test that the California court used was the test by Justice Kennedy. He was the only person, but he gave a test called significant nexus. So was there a significant nexus between the waters of the United States and the wetland? And so what went up to the Supreme Court was whether or not that was the right test. They said no. They said that's not the right test. So that goes back, and without question, that reduces, their test reduces probably by 25% the amount of wetland that is now being regulated in the United States. But why am I pointing that out? Well, first of all, natural resource damages, the Clean Water Act, and the jurisdiction of the Clean Water Act is enormously important. But one other aspect of the decision written by Justice Alito, he says that when you have contrasting or parallel lines of law, in this case, it would be this. Normally, the state has jurisdiction over a lot of things that happen in water issues. And when you have that intersection, once again, Congress has to speak clearer than they normally would. So you can see this theme came out of Texas, or excuse me, came out of the West Virginia case, a theme here that says in these cases, Congress is going to have to speak way clearer than they have in the past. Here is, see if I can work this there. Joe, while you're doing that, I'm going to talk. There's another case which really hasn't fallen. Oh, there we go. Hasn't fallen. Their National Pork Producers case. And the reason why I have that is because this is a state case. This is California having their own referendum about how you handle pigs and how much room they should have. Basically, about the size of that table is the law that passed. That was challenged by the pork producers who said, that are outside of California, that said that's going to have a significant impact on what we do, and therefore you're violating the Dormant Commerce Clause. Now this looks like a serious change because we have the majority upholding the California law, notwithstanding the fact it was being challenged by everybody outside of California. Why that's true? Because there's a lot of state things happening on climate issues, a lot of state things happening in PFAS. It kind of looks like the state will get more deference perhaps than the federal government does in some circumstances. And here's an example. Here's another example of water issues. The Colorado River, which has 20 tribes in a number of states and is a gigantic source of water quantity. If you're in the West, the challenge by the Navajo tribe was we should be there. We should be getting water from the Colorado River, and you, United States, should be giving it to us. So this is trust responsibilities. The United States has trust responsibilities to the tribe, bumping up against water quantity issues. I often say when I'm on the East Coast, I'm talking about water quality. When I'm on the West Coast, I'm talking about water quantity. So we have that intersection again. Kavanaugh, writing for the majority, says no. The United States does not have an affirmative responsibility to get water for the tribe. That does not mean the water, they don't deserve it. That does not mean they don't have the need. It just, the trust responsibility is not there. Okay, that's 4. Here's the new cases coming up. The first one is getting a lot of attention right now. It is not scheduled for argument yet. I have here Loper, but there's another case that has been joined with that same, but it's the same issue, called Relentless. The underlying facts is just whether or not a NOAA rule that requires there to be monitors on a ship and the ship owner has to pay for it. That's really the issue of the regulation. Forget it. Those facts are really not the issue. The issue is the Chevron case. Chevron is the most cited case in the United States and has been since it came out, because Chevron is the case that gives deference to federal agencies when regulations are ambiguous. If they're not ambiguous, then you get no deference at all. But if it is, then you get deference as to what that federal agency thinks the law means. And I say it's cited all the time. It's a very significant case. I used to say when I was at the Department of Justice, you know, we have screensavers. Most people had like their kids and other people. No, we had Chevron because we knew we were going to cite it during the day sometime there. So they have taken the case. Now, remember, I told you they reversed 70% of the time. So the chances they were taking that case to say something good about Chevron is probably 0 there. But a gigantic case that will influence what happens in the future, just depending on what they rule. They can narrow Chevron or they could reverse it. Stay tuned. That's a case up there. Here's another case. Everybody's following that. So not so many people are following the next one, which is a case called Jarkissi. Jarkissi is coming out of the Fifth Circuit. The Fifth Circuit it's an SEC case. It's not an environmental case, but you'll see why I think it's so important, because it impacts NRD potentially. It's a hedge fund operator who did bad things. SEC comes after them in an administrative case, not a judicial, an administrative. The Fifth Circuit says that's wrong. It's wrong for a couple of reasons. One of the reasons why it's wrong is you didn't give them a jury trial. The Seventh Amendment to the Constitution gives a jury trial in some circumstances, not all circumstances. And the Fifth Circuit said you should have given a jury trial here. And second, the SEC had the option of going in administratively or going into a judicial way into court, and that is by itself unconstitutional. So they have both of them. So this is a significant impact on administrative law. Why does that matter to people doing NRD cases? There's a trail case. It's not before the Supreme Court right now called AIR, E-R-R. AIR is an Oil Pollution Act case. So this is right in the midst of what we do on natural resource damages. And the Fifth Circuit in that case also said it was wrong enforcement case because it didn't give a jury there. So the jury issues is there, even though this doesn't look like an environmental case, it really is, and it could happen to us. Here's just a couple of things there. Think of this as a preview of coming attractions for what's going to be decided or talked about here during this wonderful course. Here, you know, a lot of things that are happening in natural resource damages are happening in states. States, some of them have their own laws. Many of them are bringing their own cases. I put this up here because it is the first one where you're having a state doing PFAS. So this is a PFAS NRD case, and I wanted you to see it because it's the first one. There's others. There will be lots of others, but this is not the federal government. This is the state. And then here is just because it's normal. Here is the most recent federal government natural resource damage case. It's Gloucester, Massachusetts. There was an old gas company that had been there for 100 years. These things have happened before. In their processing over the 100 years, they leaked contaminants that hit the groundwater, hit the nearby soil, impacted the NRD of the nearby water. The trustees, Department of Interior, Fish and Wildlife Service, bring a case. What do they do for that case? They want to have their money back that they have spent analyzing that, and then they want to have money. They want to have money that does projects in the future. This is a standard, everyday natural resource damage type case, but we didn't see them for a while. Now we are. They are using the tools that are available right now. New tools? Here's new tools. If it happens, there's going to be a panel discussion on that, so I'm not going to cover it except to say that there are proposals out there that I think would benefit and expedite and improve natural resource damages so that you're going to have a panel on that. All right, what did I do? What did I cover? I talked about the Supreme Court writ large, the 9 justices and how they vote and what they do. Hold in your mind, 70% of the time they're going to reverse the case. I talked about 4 cases that had already been decided. 2 of them stand for the proposition that in bigger or more important cases, Congress is going to have to speak way clearer than they have in the past, which is going to affect all of us in litigation in the future. And then I told you about the pork producers, which honors a state. I told you about the Arizona case, which looks at water quantity issues. And then 2 cases on the horizon that you should look at. One of them is the Chevron case, that's what they call it, which is the Loper. And the second is not so much coverage, but you see very important, the Jarkissi case, because it looks at jury issues and administrative tribunals, which happens a lot in our world. All right, with that, I'm going to sit down and turn it over back to you, Joe.
We're going to change something on the screen.
Wanna go back
Thank you,
to the-
Joe. And apologies, we know that you could give us days of your knowledge base.
We are going to turn to Peter Haig next.
Okay. Hello. Guess this is on. My name is Peter Haig. I'm Senior Director for Corporate Relations in the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. We go primarily by our acronym, which is NFWF,
Up here.
and our grantees know us as NIFWF.
Get
So
rid-
that's
get
how
rid
you
of
can call
this.
us, NIFWF. We were created during the Reagan years in 1984.
Yes. This is what you
to
want.
develop
These are the people who are
public-private
speaking now.
partnerships. We are a nonprofit.
So you want to
Based here in
maximize that.
DC. And we're set up to sustain and restore and enhance the natural
Careful.
resources, habitat for fish and wildlife here in the U.S. and its territories. We do that primarily through public-private partnerships, bringing together funding from corporate, federal agencies, as well as private foundations to fund conservation projects. The Secretary of Interior actually appoints our board, so we're very closely aligned there. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and NOAA actually sit on our board of directors. We work closely with many different agencies throughout the U.S. government, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Forest Service, DOD actually, and a few others. We also work with corporations that include Walmart, General Mills, Nestle, Cargill, FedEx. We also work with a couple of different companies such as International Paper, Southern Company, Shell, and so on. One of the things I think is important about us as well, speaking of litigation, is we do not litigate and we do not lobby or advocate, and that's really written into our charter. We do, however, have a group called the Impact Directed Environmental Accounts, I think stands for IDEA. And those, that group within NIFWIF is set up to manage funds that come out of settlements. So we're not actively involved in the litigation, but if a settlement comes out of litigation, then we have the ability to put those funds to work. We kind of, I think the largest case study there would be the Deepwater Horizon, where after settlement, we were the recipient of about $2.5 billion in funds, which we have been directing to the Gulf and the environment restoration there. So the main thing about us is we are an implementer. Last year, we awarded over 800 grants to the tune of about $500 million. That gets matched by our grantees. And over the course of the last 40 years since we were created, we've actually made over 22,000 grants to about 6,000 organizations. And the total conservation value of those investments comes to about $10 billion. So we're excited. We've been growing. The gentleman, sorry, I'm forgetting his name, mentioned the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, and prior to that, the bipartisan infrastructure bill. We've been seeing funds come through the agencies, and we've been working with agencies to get that funding on the ground. So the last couple of years, our funding levels have actually accelerated and increased. So I think that's just kind of an important takeaway. We also, I think part of what distinguishes us as well is our on-the-ground implementation partners. So we work very much with large NGOs like the Nature Conservancy, as well as, say, Ducks Unlimited or the Trust for Public Land. But we also work with state resource agencies. We have a grant through our National Coastal Resilience Fund that went to the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources, for instance. We were doing a barrier island in conjunction with them. And we work with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. That particular project was using dredge material to help restore some of the nearby islands. We also work with smaller organizations, though, as well. So our model allows us to get funding out through competitive grant process to, say, soil and water districts and so on across the U.S. A couple of examples, just kind of give you a sense. Here on the East Coast, we work in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. We work very closely with the EPA as well as other partners there. And we put about $40 to $60 million a year into the watershed for a whole range of conservation practices, wetlands restoration, oyster reefs, all directed toward freshwater, improving water quality, as well as providing habitat for native wildlife. In the Great Lakes, we have a Great Lakes wide, it's called Sustain Our Great Lakes Program, an established program that has, since 2006, given out something to the tune of about 500 grants in the range of about $130 million. And that's been going also toward wetlands restoration and a whole host of conservation activities, small stream restoration, targeting biodiversity. And I should say, all of our programs have some kind of biodiversity component, some kind of species benefit. So in the Great Lakes, we have indicator species that include the brook trout as well as shorebirds across that landscape. In the grasslands, in the Great Plains, this is the northern Great Plains, we've been working for the past 6 years. We've put actual awarded grants of about 50 million, but that's been matched. So the total conservation value in that landscape's in the area of about 120 million. And we've been securing or improving or restoring approximately 5 million acres in that landscape. We're also looking at significant landscape improvements in the southern Great Plains and elsewhere in the Great Plains. And there, we're looking at migratory species, including the pronghorn and elk and mule deer. There's also one of the most endangered species in the world is the black-footed ferret, which many of you may not know about, but they're down to like the last few individuals, and we've been really working hard to get them restored as well. And we could talk about species all day long in terms of some of the impacts that habitat restoration in that landscape. In the southeast, the very critical resource is the longleaf pine habitat. Several of our partners that we work with depend on working lands and forests in that system, including International Paper. They make, they're a paper company that make many of the boxes that we get our Amazon products in, as well as Southern Company, which is an energy company there in the southeast. We work very closely with our implementation partners to engage private landowners around forest restoration and forest stewardship in order to not only provide for restoring the forest, the longleaf forest, but also providing habitat for species. So the red cockaded woodpecker is one example. That there's something called the gopher tortoise. And these are, some of these are endemic to this area and globally rare species. And again, that's a concerted effort across many different partnerships. So it's U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, it's NRCS, it's DOD, it's the Forest Service. We're working with a whole host of federal agencies to work there. And there's a significant alliance of on-the-ground partners that has developed over the last few years, which I just can't say enough about. And finally, the National Coastal Resilience Fund. This was a bipartisan initiative legislated in 2018 that was funded at the time to the tune of about 35 million a year. After the bipartisan infrastructure bill, we were able to increase that to about 140 million a year. We've got several partners, EPA, DOD, NOAA is a strong partner, and I understand they're in the room, so I want to give a call out to them. But doing some great work across coastal areas around the U.S. and along the Great Lakes, Alaska, Hawaii, and so on, and just really focused on nature-based solutions for improving community resilience using tools such as restoring wetlands to help improve resilience for sea level rise and flooding for communities. But also things like living shorelines, dune restoration, barrier islands, and a whole host of different tools that have been implemented through that program. So we're really excited. There's also a significant amount of funding that comes in to match those funds. So we're really excited about that program and the ability to improve life for those communities and help restore habitat. Just kind of closing, all of these different programs that I've mentioned bring together public and private funding. So the model there really helps bring public and private entities together from multiple different areas. So we have private foundations. The Bezos Earth Foundation's been, or Earth Fund, has been a strong partner over the last couple of years, for instance, and getting those funds on the ground to really make a difference. So a lot of that has to do with our science-based approach as well, and really looking at measurable outcomes. I'll just close there, and we can pick it up on the Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Jeffrey Rose?
Great, thank you. Good afternoon or good morning. Jeff Rose with Battelle, and really a pleasure to be here with you. You know you're on a good panel when you're caught like taking notes from all the other speakers when they're talking and such. So it's really a pleasure to be here. on this panel and thank Barbara for the opportunity to join you again this year and talk about what's happened over the last year. And as she kind of referenced in her preamble, a lot in 1 year, particularly when it pertains to Congress and the EPA and private industry. Just real quick, Battelle is a nonprofit science and technology company. We're based out of Columbus, Ohio. We're really all about biology, chemistry, and advanced materials, trying to solve really hard problems. So it was interesting, hearing Roger talk a little bit about, the call to action from corporations. I felt a lot like he was talking about Battelle and some of the work that we're doing, trying to bring solutions forward. And along those lines, as I talk about PFAS, as that nonprofit, we're not necessarily pushing or advocating for particular standards, but what we're really trying to do is bring technology and solutions forward to trying to solve really hard problems for the betterment of society. So I'll say that, up front in my comments. But really, this is, PFAS is really one of those issues I joked around. I've been active on the Hill on this issue for half a dozen years or so, 5 years or so. Prior to being with Battelle, I used to run natural resources for a couple different governors. I ran a couple different state agencies in my home state of New Hampshire under, then Governor Hassan and then Governor Sununu. So, I do have that natural resources background and perspective and know how important PFAS is as an issue. But I joke because, 4 or 5 years ago, people didn't know how to spell PFAS in Congress, and now it seems like you can't go anywhere without somebody talking about it. There's lots of pieces of legislation that are consistently being introduced. I think there are 37 that have been introduced so far this year. I'm sure that will increase. There are a lot of stakeholders. It's really one of those issues that it's kind of a nonpartisan issue. It's fairly ubiquitous. It doesn't matter whether you're North, South, Republican, Democrat, House, or Senate. Pretty much everywhere there has been impacted by PFAS. You'll see things like the PFAS Action Task Force that's in the House. You just saw last week 26 senators signed a letter to DOD urging them to increase their funding levels that they're requesting to Congress to try to solve and bring more funding to accelerate the cleanup and assessments of these different sites. There are over 400 sites across the U.S., military sites that have been identified as contaminated with PFAS. That number is likely to just increase, particularly as they continue to measure to new standards that I'll talk to here a little bit in a moment. And then you've seen, as referenced, a commitment to funding through things like the bipartisan infrastructure law. That's a major effort that Congress has brought forward in that bipartisan fashion, bringing $10 billion to trying to help address PFAS. They've pushed out through about $2 billion of that thus far. And one of the other issues that is not got, I think it does not have a resolution yet, but is very much on the forefront of the minds of Congress, is in the Environment and Public Works Committee in the Senate trying to get a PFAS authorization bill forward. And that has a lot of really significant pieces in it. It's kind of stalled at the moment. They were trying to get something in a bipartisan fashion through back in the spring and early summer, and they haven't really been able to get their head around two really big issues that maybe will be discussed a little bit later today. One is, how do you deal with secondary receivers? Those utilities, for instance, that might be trying to pull PFAS out of the drinking water to make sure you have safe drinking water and you meet those standards. But what do you do with that drinking water, that PFAS that's been taken out and removed, generally speaking, through like a granulated activator filter? What do you do with that now that you have that PFAS as a secondary receiver? So how do you address that liability issue? The Republicans have recently come out on the committee and saying that they want to have an exemption to CERCLA for those secondary receivers, and traditionally that's something that's been, kind of hands off, right? You don't want to see any exemptions, and that kind of chips away at the integrity of the CERCLA bill and process right now. So that's a major sticking point that they have not been able to resolve. As much as Chairman Carper wants to try to bring something forward, was hoping to bring it forward through the NDAA, that's still a point that they haven't hit full resolution on. The other one is just definition of PFAS. It sounds kind of simple, but when you're dealing with thousands of chemicals, and there's still hundreds of them in commerce, and yet you've only really done the toxicological profile and understanding on just a couple of them, how do you bring that forward? Do you do it as an individual set of chemicals or as a class of chemicals? So those are two really big issues, and I know that's something that the EPW committee is working very hard on. The other thing I just mentioned is the NDAA has also been a major vehicle for advancing policy over the last handful of years. I spoke a bit about that last year, really kind of kicking off in 2020, and you're seeing some of the implementation of those requirements, such as phasing out of AFFF by the DoD, which is a major source of groundwater contamination around military sites. And you see a lot of these other provisions that are in the NDAA. The FY24 NDAA, which has not been finalized yet, they're still trying to get resolution and bring a committee of conference together between the House and the Senate, has additional provisions for PFAS. Most notably, they have things such as restrictions on what DoD can procure in terms of other items and articles that have PFAS in them, more sort of examinations and testing and doing blood testing for service members, as well as the requirement to build into understanding what non-incineration technologies for PFAS waste DoD might be looking at. So again, more to come on that as hopefully a final NDAA gets passed before the end of the calendar year. On the EPA front, again, a lot happening. Not all done, but means to an end of trying to move forward with what EPA has outlined as their PFAS action plan. That was initially outlined by Secretary Wheeler and then Secretary Regan under both administrations, a Republican and a Democrat administration, but they continue to push forward with trying to bring action around these measures. The two biggest items really is the intent that the notice for advanced rulemaking for establishing an MCL, maximum contaminant limit, that will establish 6 different types of PFAS with enforceable limits. For PFOA and PFAS, they're talking about 4 parts per trillion. More likely than not, that's what that standard is going to be. And that's an enforceable level. That's a big deal, a lot different than the 70 parts per trillion non-enforceable advisory level that DoD and many other states are currently working towards. So that's going to have a dramatic impact on outcomes. And so more to come on that one. And then the other one is the notice of rulemaking to designate PFOA and PFAS as a hazardous substance under CERCLA. So those are the 2 real big ones. Now all of a sudden it's listed as hazardous. That's a call to action. And now you have an enforceable drinking water standard. That's a call to action. And those are both going to be very significant. They're in the means of going through that, those process. You'll see those advance again next calendar year where they try to come out with the final rules. And I'm sure there'll be comment periods that will be taking place on that. EPA is pushing on a whole bunch of other things, a lot of them really about reporting and transparency, trying to make sure they understand where the PFAS is, trying to limit it upstream as much as they can. The other thing that they also have, they're on the hook for at the end of this calendar year, is to update the PFAS guidance disposal guidance. They offered up their interim guidance at the end of 2020. A lot of people have been waiting to see what that updated guidance is going to look like and what are the mechanisms that are available to getting rid of this stuff. And that kind of brings really to the last piece, and that's what is happening out there. What is the available options that the private sector is moving forward and trying to make investments into? Because quite frankly, the options today are pretty limited. Incineration, not really a good option. You're not getting complete destruction. You're getting particles of incomplete combustion. The EPA has kind of outlined that they don't think it's a really good idea. The DoD did actually get out from underneath the incineration moratorium. They issued their updated guidance back in July, and they said so they got out of that moratorium. But they said, but we're still not. This is my TV timeout. But we're still not going to actually start incinerating quite yet because there's still a lot of concerns. And the EPA told them as much, like, hey, look, there's no real world evidence here. And there's no validation that you're actually destroying the PFAS. There's no continuous monitoring of that actual destruction, which is another big challenge that is out there, is that there's not a verification around what is destruction. Because you can see some of these technologies might take it from a long chain to a short chain, but you're not getting complete combustion or destruction. Same with landfilling, having a lot of challenges with that, getting it into the groundwater and landfill leachate. deep well injection. Again, these are not methods by which you're actually destroying it. So you do see you do see technologies making advancements. Battelle is actually one of those companies. We have a technology that we've been working with called supercritical water oxidation, SCWO, which actually does have the ability to completely destroy these PFAS wastes. That's not a technology that's exclusive to Battelle. There are other companies that have SCWO technology. And so we're thinking that that's going to be one of those primary new innovations that are available to help destroy these PFAS waste. Battelle actually spun out a new company over the last year called Revive Environmental, which actually has the first commercial available technology for destruction of PFAS in aqueous states today. And we're destroying PFAS waste up in Michigan. It's permitted at the local level. We're working very closely with EPA, and it's actually destroying AFFF on behalf of a couple of different states with take-back programs, working with destroying landfill leachate as well. So it's pretty exciting to see that technology that's available at scale today. We're, I think, out in Hill Air Force Base right now, and then out to Peterson Air Force Base later in the month. There are other technologies, though, as well that are really exciting that EPA is looking at. One is called HALT, hydrothermal alkaline treatment. There's plasma treatments, electrochemical oxidation. So these are investments that are being made at the private sector to try to help with this destruction technology that's really out there. Because whether you're DOD or airports or oil and gas or fire departments, we got to figure out how to get rid of this stuff so you can get rid of the source of the problem, so you can make sure that you have the safe drinking water. Last thing I'll just mention is, in terms of what's changed, while there's a lot of focus right now on drinking water and hazardous designations, those are the real big ones that are out there. Don't fall asleep on things like Clean Air Act and the Clean Air Act requirements that might be coming down. RCRA permitting, because just because it doesn't say you can't doesn't mean it says that you can, and those types of impacts that are going to happen out there. So I'll stop there and look forward to taking questions and answers or talking to folks more during the lunchtime break.
Thank you very much. We're going to turn to Professor Gerard on Zoom. Would you like to test your audio? Professor Gerard, I think can you hear us?
Okay, let's see if we can do this. Do we have anything on mute here? No.
I've unmuted everybody.
Okay.
Jessica, can you try unmuting from your end?
Yes, I'm unmuted on mine.
Okay, so she works.
I do hear feedback for what it's worth.
Can Michael unmute? Kara, can you unmute him?
I'm trying.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, bravo. Yay.
Oh, great. Sorry about the AV problems.
It's part.
And I'm hearing myself twice, but are you only hearing me once?
We're only hearing you once, so make it good.
Yes, I muted the main room, so you should be good.
Okay, great. So I'm going to try in the next 10 minutes or so to talk about the developments in the last year or two on climate change. And the biggest climate change news of the last year has been the climate itself. The last 12 months are the 12-month period in recorded history. All sorts of records have been broken by a wide margin: extreme heat, wildfires, floods, melting of the glaciers, and so on. The 1.5 degree goal that we strive for under Paris seems unreachable. 2 degrees is dicey. Yesterday, the latest report came out, the National Climate Assessment, and it is the most authoritative description of what's happening physically with climate change in the United States. So the most important thing by far from the legal or regulatory perspective, of course, is the implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act that was enacted in August of 2022. It's the biggest legislation ever on climate change, although, of course, it is mostly not regulatory. It's mostly about providing a lot of money for the clean energy transition. We've seen a constant flow of announcements of grants and programs coming out of the Department of Energy and other agencies. And this is helping to spark a tremendous amount of growth in wind and solar and storage and hydrogen and carbon capture and sequestration and direct air capture. And there are real opportunities there for a lot of businesses in all of those areas. All those technologies need to grow tremendously if we're going to meet the climate challenge. We need a lot more growth than we are seeing in transmission. Everybody recognizes that a large growth in electric transmission is essential, but we're not seeing it actually happen on the ground at nearly the extent that's needed. There are real challenges that are being faced in all these technologies, challenges with workforce and supply chains and local opposition. And now we're seeing that high interest rates are causing major problems. Just in the last few weeks, we've seen the cancellation of several major offshore wind projects off New York and New Jersey, and the cancellation of a leading small modular nuclear reactor project. All of this worsened by the high interest rates. On the regulatory front, a slew of new regulations have been coming out of the Biden administration. These include mobile sources, both passenger vehicles and heavy-duty vehicles, regulation of the power sector, in part to replace the Clean Power Plan that the Supreme Court said was invalid, controls on methane leakage from the oil and gas industry, regulation of hydrofluorocarbons, changes to the regulations under NEPA and the Endangered Species Act, and changes in the calculation of the social cost of carbon and the way that cost-benefit analysis is done. In almost all of these, we're seeing the Biden administration working to reverse the actions that were taken by the Trump administration to weaken the standards and now work to not only reinstate the Obama-era standards, but to go beyond them. Just about all the new regulations are challenged in court, mostly by red state attorneys general and some industry groups, as soon as they are issued in final form, and sometimes before they're in final form. So far, none of these regulations have been struck down by the courts. We are awaiting the action by the Securities and Exchange Commission, but I believe that Jessica Thurston is going to talk about that and about the new California laws on climate disclosure. There's also a lot of activity at the state level. Michigan just passed a suite of important new climate laws. New York State passed a climate law 3 years ago and is now in the process of devising its cap and invest program that is supposed to take effect next year, although it may be delayed, but that'll be a very major program in New York. We see a lot of legislative and regulatory activity in California and Colorado and Illinois and some other states. And a great deal is happening on the climate litigation front. The Sabin Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia, which I've run, has a website in which we attempt to track all of the climate litigation in the world. We've counted a total of about 2,300 lawsuits having been brought on climate change globally. About 70% of those are in the U.S. Very prominently in the U.S., there are about 25 lawsuits against the major oil and gas companies, brought mostly by states and cities. They've been held up for several years by the issue of whether they belong in federal court or state court. The plaintiffs want to be in state court. The defendants want to be in federal court. Just about all of the district courts and courts of appeals that had to deal with that issue ruled the cases should stay in state court. And the Supreme Court has now denied cert on that. So the cases are moving forward in state court. They're all facing motions to dismiss on various legal grounds. Just a couple of weeks ago, the Hawaii Supreme Court denied motions to dismiss the lawsuit that had been brought there by Honolulu. So that case is moving forward to discovery. That's the first top state court to rule on these issues, and the Hawaii Supreme Court denied the motions to dismiss on the basis of Clean Air Act preemption and various other grounds. And so I think we'll start to see decisions from other state courts on this. We'll see discovery and undoubtedly discovery disputes, but we may begin to see trials in some of these cases. One prominent trial that did take place last June was a case called Held versus Montana. It was actually only the second time ever that there had been an actual trial with live witnesses under oath and subject to cross-examination, talking about climate science. The case was brought under the environmental rights provision of the Montana state constitution, challenging a Montana rule that prohibited state officials from even considering climate change and making energy policy. After the trial, the state court ruled for the plaintiffs on everything. They upheld the conclusions about standing, about climate science and so forth, and declared that one state policy to be unconstitutional in violation of the state environmental rights provision. The state has now appealed that to the Montana State Supreme Court. So this ruling has a very narrow, direct impact. It's just ruling out this one policy under the Montana state constitution, but it's energizing a lot of efforts around the country to have similar lawsuits and to try to enact environmental rights provisions in the constitutions of other states. So far, only about 4 other states have that. One of them is Hawaii, and a trial has been scheduled for next July in Hawaii on a lawsuit under the Hawaii Constitution challenging the transportation policies of Hawaii. Internationally, 2 pending cases that many companies are looking at closely. One of them is called Mea Defensie versus Royal Dutch Shell. The plaintiff, that's Dutch for environmental defense. The trial court in the Netherlands held that Royal Dutch Shell needed to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by a substantial proportion by 2030. And this applied not only to the parent company, but also to all affiliated companies globally, and not only to the direct emissions of the company, but also to the emissions of its customers, the Scope 3 emissions. Which is obviously challenging. So that decision is now under appeal to the Intermediate Appellate Court in the Netherlands, and presumably it'll go up to the Supreme Court of the Netherlands, however that turns out. Another important pending case is called Lua versus RWE, brought by a Peruvian farmer who says that his farm is endangered by the melting of the Andes. Says that RWE, the largest electric utility in Germany, is responsible for 0.5% of the greenhouse gases load in the atmosphere. And he's suing in the courts of Germany for 0.5% of his anticipated damages. So that case survived initial motions to dismiss. A panel of judges actually traveled to Peru a few months ago to see the Alps. The Andes, rather, the melting glaciers, and we're waiting for a decision there. The final thing I wanted to point out is that there are climate cases pending before 4 international tribunals: the International Court of Justice, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, the European Court of Human Rights, and the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea. So we would expect to see decisions in the next year or 2 from these tribunals on the human rights obligations and other implications of greenhouse gas emissions and preparation for climate change. These tribunals, other than the European one, are purely able to issue advisory opinions in these kinds of cases, but these kinds of advisory opinions are likely to have a real impact on the domestic courts in a number of other countries that have signed on to these international human rights treaties, which the U.S. has not signed on to. And I think that these may add to pressure on U.S. companies that are operating abroad, and also add to the diplomatic pressure on the U.S. to deal with climate change. So that's my brief summary of what's happening with climate change. And regrettably, I have to sign off in about 5 minutes to chair another program, but I was happy to join you remotely for now.
Thank you so much, Professor Gerard. We are going to turn to
Okay, and in the
Jessica
room,
Thurston.
you're going to have to unmute the microphone at the computer. Sorry.
Thank you so much, Professor Gerard. We understand that you have to hop off. That is okay. We are going to turn to Jessica Thurston, who is also on Zoom with us.
Thanks, Joe. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. It's really an incredible honor to be here as a corporate person, hearing from everyone so close to all of this important work and these regulatory and legal changes and challenges. So I very much appreciate it. My name is Jessica Thurston. My pronouns are she, her. I am the Vice President of ESG and Sustainability for Paramount Global, which might sort of surprise you with a company like ours being here, but I'll get into a bit of why this topic is so important to us. And for those not familiar, Paramount Global is the international and multinational media company home to such brands as Nickelodeon, CBS, News and Sports. Until recently, Simon & Schuster, we just sold it, but other brands like MTV, VH1, Paramount Pictures, and many, many more. And I'll also say thank you for letting me zoom in to this. I am at the point in pregnancy where I can't travel, so I am here in New York joining you all. I'm very honored to be. In addition to my role, as mentioned before, I'm adjunct faculty at Columbia University as well. I teach in the Graduate Sustainability Management Program in ESG-aligned corporate governance, as well as in corporate sustainability strategy and reporting. So these issues are very important to me, and very much, my academic background informs our approach at Paramount Global. So what I'll talk about, and we'll attempt to keep my remarks brief with an eye on the time here, is a few things. I want to talk about corporate accountability and reporting around natural resources, but even sort of more broadly in the light of recent developments and how these different mandatory disclosure regulations and policies are impacting corporate entities, particularly those that are publicly traded, and then how we're dealing with it. I can only speak as Paramount, though I'll share with you how, at least academically, I approach this as very beneficial to business practices, and we'll share a bit of what companies like mine want to hear from stakeholders like all of you and how we move this work forward. So to start, I want to talk about the sort of trends of these changes, and a lot of folks have touched on this already today. But what we are seeing is finally, really at long last, a confluence of standards and regulatory expectations for mostly publicly traded companies to do a few things. Really the trend in all of this, and when I say all of this, I mean, I'll get into some specific examples, but I mean the pending SEC climate change rules, CSRD out of the European Union, the laws in California, other sort of state and local laws. The trend is, while complicated, very much towards consistency in disclosure. What has plagued us in the world of ESG, and specifically in environmental and natural resources disclosures, is what I consider a very convenient excuse for many corporations that there's no consistent metric or methodology for disclosure. There's no consistent denominator. There's no consistent way to articulate the, intensity of certain metrics, and that chaos has complicated disclosures for companies, but I think more importantly, challenged our ability to make real progress and to hold corporations accountable to manage their material impacts. And so this sort of confluence of new rules and standards has, while it all shakes out and is overwhelming to a lot of companies, particularly those that are earlier in their reporting and disclosure journey, these new rules, even just focusing on the SEC rules, should over time allow us to hone in on what is truly material to a company, environmentally and socially, governance related, but environmentally and socially predominantly. And how are the decisions that the company makes related to those impacts actually managed? Because on one hand, we see a requirement for more and more disclosure, whether it is, so just take, for example, related to greenhouse gas emissions. Many companies pushed back on the SEC climate rules proposal, saying it was an undue burden to calculate and make public their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. I would personally challenge what a burden it is. So scope 3 is quite difficult. But the rules go beyond just put those numbers out for the sake of putting them out. These rules are intended to say, how are you managing that? How are you making decisions around anything that has a climate impact to or from your company? What are the decisions that are influencing your climate risk assessment? The rules here, I'll get into the SEC a bit now, which are, we believe, delayed now until taking effect in 2026 on FY25 disclosures. But regardless, these rules intend to say, be consistent in your disclosures. If you have said in your ESG reports, for example, that you care about the environment and you're focused on mitigating climate change and adapting to it, well, then that needs to show up in your 10K. That needs to be communicated and calculated with the same rigor that we apply to their financial disclosures. I personally very much welcome this, and I'm also saying that with my academic hat on. In reality, where this becomes complicated for companies and where you may continue to see pushback is that there's not an existing system in most publicly traded companies to address these changes. Meaning, if there is not a pronounced and explicit governance structure in place at a company that brings together controls, the ESG team, legal, and finance, it is sort of like with SOX. There are new teams needing to be stood up to understand how do we actually, what are our controls around our ESG data, particularly our climate data? And to what extent does that need to be evaluated with the same rigor that we evaluate our other disclosures? That ambiguity is where reasonable pushback on these rules lies. Now, it will be solved. We are moving towards this trend of disclosure. There are a lot of law firms in particular that are very helpful to us in this space. And as we see the European Union's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the CSRD, take effect, which will happen around now the same time as these SEC rules, though its criteria will be clearer sooner, that it will be adopted. It is supposed to be formally adopted by member states of the EU by August of 2024. We're going to get more clarity around, okay, what are regulators actually expecting when it comes to disclosure of climate risk assessment? Same thing with the two new rules out of California. They're 261 and 253. And while they differ, essentially what they are saying is if you are a corporate of a certain size, measured by revenue, and you do business in California, then you are now subject to scope 1, 2, and 3 disclosure regulations. And so regardless of when the SEC rules take effect, we're already moving in that direction. but you will still continue to see inconsistencies in disclosures from companies. I'll also flag, without going into too much detail, again, keeping a bit of an eye on the time, there's also one other large category of disclosure changes that is, I think, going to throw companies for a bit of a loop, and it's around greenwashing, particularly when it comes to plastics. That's where we see a really significant amount of greenwashing. And if I'm being kind and optimistic, I'll say most companies are not set up to properly evaluate green claims. And that lack of process has led us to this point where there are very inconsistent commitments and statements made publicly on packaging, on hang tags, on what have you in the world of consumer products. And so there are different greenwashing rules. There's, the FTC has its green guides. Those are not binding, except then there could certainly be follow-up. But in the European Union, there are binding regulations now in place and also taking other form. We're also seeing some in Australia. There will be others coming out. All of this is to say, there will be a new rigor applied to statements made by companies. And over time, in the short term, we might see a constriction of commitments. We might see the aperture closing because companies are potentially nervous about overstating these commitments. And there is some pushback that says, do all of these greenwashing rules mean that now companies are not going to make sustainability commitments, not going to put out products that are more responsible for the environment, using less plastic, what have you? I don't believe that. I believe that we might see a bit of an overcorrection in the short term, but we really do need some controls, because if you look at the marketplace, there are a lot of commitments that have some sort of messaging around responsible plastic usage, and really it's just about the packaging itself, or it means some percentage of that product had something responsible. It's too broad of a landscape right now. I'll make a quick plug for our program. We have a program called Operation Sea Change. You probably didn't think you'd hear about SpongeBob SquarePants today, but it is a very important IP to us, and we've used this cartoon that is about ocean conservation at its core. That is how it was started 25 years ago, to say we will put in place a commitment to remove plastics from the oceans, which comes through a few different formats. But it is our way of saying, we'll take our most important IP to then reevaluate what sorts of commitments we are making in terms of plastic utilization and the removal of it from the creation of consumer products. So you might see more programs like that crop up as well. And then I'll just wrap by saying that, a lot of this, why companies, I think, are starting to be more receptive, we certainly are, to this clarification in the proliferation of disclosures, is that our investors want this too. We get questions from our investors about this frameworks to which we are reporting. Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, for example, is one that comes up probably the most in my conversations with our investor community. And I'll echo what Roger said earlier, that we need, many of you in the room, we need folks in government and adjacent to help be this catalyst for corporate transformation and evolution, creating space for us to act. Because these regulations and disclosures, while complex and candidly very resource intensive as we amend the way we work and our governance practices, they also allow us to have a new lens on risk mitigation. They allow us as companies to find new opportunities for efficiencies. And so I don't want to downplay the complexity of integrating environmental and financial disclosures, but it is a very important step towards true evaluation and comparison between companies for investors, but for very important stakeholders like the environment itself that doesn't get to pick up the phone and give me a call. So I'll just end to say, I really welcome more dialogue on specifically the natural resources, specifically for this group, but the category of natural resources broadly, because what does get lost in these conversations of new climate risk disclosures and so on is an understanding of how companies need to be disclosing and what they need to be disclosing when it comes to natural resource impacts and biodiversity. And so, there's very classic ways that companies are reached out to about these topics. There are shareholder resolutions, there's letters to leadership, but I personally want to hear other folks in ESG like me that lead ESG for large companies. We want to hear what is the information that you need from companies like ours, even if it's a media company where our biggest impacts are through our content and what we show on screen. What do you want to hear from us and for us to be disclosing? I just really welcome that, and thank you so much for my time.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Do we have time for questions?
Yes, I think we could take a couple questions, and then I've got a couple words to say before we
Awesome.
launch.
Sounds good. Does anybody from the audience have any questions?
Yeah, and if you want to use the mics, these gentlemen can help. Okay, let's bring a mic to you. Can you take these mics? Yeah. So they're on. And that one. Yeah, they're on. Thank you, everybody, for those excellent comments. We could do a whole day on this panel next
Really
year.
could.
Hi, thank you for taking my question. Yes, I was just going to Barbara. Thank you. Margaret O'Gorman, WHC. This was a really great panel, and really mine is an addition rather than a question, if that's okay. I work at the intersection of...
We mainly want questions, because we've only got a couple minutes.
Yeah, okay. So I guess my question is, for the people on the panel, where is the evolution of nature in this? The biggest thing that happened in the last 12 months was the Convention on Biological Diversity, Kunming Montreal Global Framework for Nature, which is impacting companies in this country, even though we're not a signatory. I think that Jessica touched on it, and I would just love to hear some more about that, if it's on your radar at all, I guess. Thank you.
It might be better to relegate that to the conversation on nature that will happen after Phil Levin.
I actually could not totally hear the question, so I had to defer to others first.
Happy to park it, Barbara. Happy to park it. I'm not sure if you can hear me. I said I'm happy to park that question for later.
Well, yeah. Yeah, as a matter of fact, if you want to email that to us, we can actually bring it up and make sure whether all the remote and the in-person are hearing things.
Other questions?
Other questions?
Can you make sure it's on? I don't know if that was working on.
Make sure the green light is on.
It looked like it was on.
Hi, Jeff Martin, attorney with Hunt and Andrews Kurth. I've got a question for John as a fellow environmental litigator. I was interested, and thank you for your very concise summary of the major cases that we need to be following this year. One of which was the grid case involving an NRD settlement. And I was wondering if you see that as an aberration, because we're not seeing a lot of NRD cases being brought, or if you see it as part of a new wave of NRD-related litigation, and to what extent would statute of limitation issues cut into that wave if there is to be one?
No, it's a very good, it's a superb question. I use that as an example of sort of where we had been in the past. And we see this administration and the Justice Department bringing what I thought was a standard case. Absolutely standard, no frills. We just hadn't seen that for a while. And you're right, there is a statute of limitations on natural resource damage cases, which we could now encounter, which in the past, Justice was very, during my tenure, very worried about doing. And so I use that to say, here is what normalcy looked like. Not like any frills, just the kind of things that you've been doing your entire practice. We're starting to see that, and I think it's a rebound. It's a rebound rather than a reinvention.
Nice. Other questions?
We don't really have time.
No time.
12:15.
I'm so sorry.
But let me just say, I've just got a couple things to say. First of all, thank you for this excellent panel, and Jessica, thank you for your remote participation, and also Mike Gerard, who had competing things, and just wonderful to hear all of these updates. And what it says is there's a lot going on, even in the last year, and moving forward. We are in a very fast-paced environment, and so when we talk this afternoon, what we're doing with these frameworks and what we're doing with the best practices generally has to sit within this very fast-paced framework situation that we're in currently. We can't be myopic to these things anymore. There's tremendous changes going on. PFAS, climate, we'll hear more about this afternoon and how they relate to what we're going to be talking about. A couple things I wanted to say. First of all, we do have an evaluation. We've now posted it online, but I'm going to put some out at the registration desk, and we'd really like people to fill that out. Second, we had, if anyone has we had one request for a vegetarian meal. If anyone has a request for a vegan or vegetarian, could you please see me before we go out? I've asked them to segment that. And with that, we are breaking. Thank you, Joe, for your moderating this panel. We're breaking now for about, we will start in